Imagine you're out on the open ocean, thousands of miles from land. You look up, and there's a wandering albatross just gliding. This bird has the biggest wingspan on Earth.
Incredible animals. They can spend years at sea without touching down.
Right, and all that time, they're drinking salt water, eating salty fish, but inside, their body is in this perfect balance. If we tried that, we'd be in serious trouble fast.
We would die of dehydration. And that biological magic, it's really what we're digging into today. It all comes down to managing that internal stability, that homeostasis.
And that really boils down to two key challenges, right?
Yeah.
First, osmoregulation.
Controlling your salt and water balance.
And second, excretion, getting rid of all the toxic metabolic waste.
Exactly. And every animal has its own unique, ingenious way of solving that puzzle.
So let's start with the basic physics behind all of this. We have to talk about osmosis.
We do. It's the driving force. Water movement is always passive, and it just follows the solutes. So osmosis is just water diffusing across a membrane, moving from a place with low solute concentration to a place with high solute concentration.
And the term we use to measure that concentration is osmolarity.
Right. In milliosmoles per liter, or osmol. Just for context, our blood is about 300 millismol.
Okay, 300. And seawater.
Seawater is way up there, around 1,000 millismol, a huge difference.
That's a massive gradient. So these terms, isoosmotic, hyperosmotic, they're all about comparing those numbers.
They are. If two solutions are isoosmotic, they have the same osmolarity, no net water movement. But if your body fluid is at 300 and the seawater around you is at 1,000, you are hypoosmotic relative to the environment.
Meaning you're constantly losing water.
Constantly. Water will always flow out of you and into the more concentrated or hyperosmotic seawater.
And that basic physical reality forces animals into one of two main strategies.
Yep. You're either an osmoconformer or an osmoregulator.
Osmoconformers are the easygoing ones.
You could say that. They're mostly marine invertebrates, like a jellyfish or a sea star. They just let their internal osmolarity match the seawater. It's a low-energy strategy. No fighting against the current, so to speak.
But the strategy that really let life conquer the planet is osmoregulation.
Absolutely. This is where you spend energy to actively control your internal osmolarity, keeping it stable no matter what the outside world is doing. It's what lets a fish live in a river, or what lets a salmon move between the two.
Let's talk about those adaptations.
Yeah.
So a marine bony fish, like a cod, it's in that 1,000 millimol seawater.
So it's constantly losing water. Its solution is, well, it drinks a lot. It chugs seawater all day.
But then it's full of salt.
Exactly. So it uses these amazing little biological pump specialized cells in its gills to actively shoot the excess salt ions back out into the ocean. And its kidneys produce very little, very concentrated urine.
Okay, now let's flip it. A freshwater basin, a river. The water is almost pure, very low osmolarity.
Now the problem is the complete opposite. The fish is hyperosmotic to the river, so water is just flooding into its body all the time.
It must feel bloated.
I imagine so. So they do the opposite of the cod. They drink almost no water, and their kidneys work overtime, producing huge amounts of very, very dilute urine to get rid of all that excess water.
And how do they hang on to their salts?
They get some from food, but they also use pumps in their gills, just like the cod, but running in reverse, to actively pull salts in from the water.
It's just such an elegant reversal. But then you have the weirdos, like sharks.
Ah, sharks. They found a clever loophole. Their internal salt concentration is actually lower than seawater.
So they should be losing water.
They should be, but they hold on to huge amounts of urea in their blood, and another compound, TMAO, which protects their proteins from the urea.
Wait, they hold on to their own waste product?
They do, and that urea and TMAO cocktail raises their total internal osmolarity to just slightly above that of seawater.
So they are slightly hyperosmotic to the ocean.
Which means water actually flows slowly into their bodies. It's a slow, manageable trickle they can easily deal with via their kidneys. It's a genius way to avoid the dehydration problem altogether.
That's incredible. And moving from the ocean to land, well, the biggest problem is just drying out. Desiccation.
It's the #1 threat. So you see waxy layers on insects, keratinized skin on us, but the undisputed champion of surviving water loss has to be the tardigrade.
The water bear. I love these things.
They're practically indestructible. They can enter a state called anhydrobiosis, literally life without water.
So they just dry up?
Completely. They can dehydrate down to less than 2% water content and just wait for a decade or more. The secret is a sugar called trehalose. It forms a kind of glassy matrix inside their cells that protects everything until water comes back.
Which brings us full circle back to our albatross drinking that super salty ocean water.
Yeah.
How does it get a net gain of water from that?
It has a secret weapon, the nasal salt gland.
A gland in its nose.
Right above its eyes, actually. These glands are packed with those transport epithelia we mentioned, and they are incredibly efficient. They pull salt out of the blood and secrete a super concentrated salt solution that literally drips off the end of their beak.
How concentrated are we talking?
More concentrated than the seawater it drank, sometimes over 1,500 ml/osmol.
Whoa. So because the waste fluid is saltier than the intake fluid.
The bird gets a net gain of water. It's how all marine reptiles and birds survive out there. It's the ultimate desalination plant.
And that need to get rid of salt or other wastes is directly tied to an animal's water budget.
Absolutely. The nitrogenous wastes from breaking down proteins and nucleic acids are toxic, and the form you excrete them in is a huge trade-off between toxicity, energy cost, and water loss.
Okay, so let's walk through the three main options, starting with the cheapest but most toxic, ammonia.
Ammonia is nasty stuff. It's so toxic you can only tolerate it in very dilute concentrations. That means you need a ton of water to flush it out. So this is really only an option for aquatic animals, like most bony fish, who can just let it diffuse out through their gills.
Energetically cheap, but you need to be swimming in water.
Exactly. Now, if you move onto land, you can't afford to waste that much water, so you need to convert that ammonia into something safer. That brings us to urea.
Which is what we produce.
We do. Our liver combines ammonia with carbon dioxide to make urea, which is about 100,000 times less toxic than ammonia. It costs energy to make, but the water savings are huge.
And you see this adaptation in real time with amphibians.
It's a perfect example. A frog tadpole lives in water, so it excretes cheap ammonia. But when it metamorphoses into a land-dwelling frog, its liver switches over to producing urea. It adapts its waste product to its new environment.
Okay, so what's the most water-efficient option? The deluxe model of waste disposal.
That would be uric acid. It costs the most energy to produce, but it's the ultimate water saver. It's not very toxic, and crucially, it's almost completely insoluble in water.
So it comes out as a solid.
Pretty much a paste. Think of bird droppings. The white stuff is uric acid. This is the strategy for insects, birds, reptiles, anyone who absolutely cannot afford to lose water.
And that insolubility is critical for animals that lay shelled eggs.
It's a non-negotiable. If an embryo and a sealed egg produced soluble ammonia or urea, it would poison itself in its own waste. But by converting it to solid, inert uric acid, the waste can just be stored harmlessly inside the shell until the baby hatches.
Okay, so we have the waste products. Now we need the plumbing to get them out, the excretory systems.
And no matter how different they look, they all operate on the same four basic principles. It's like a little refinery.
Step one has to be filtration.
Right. Pressure pushes body fluid through a filter. Small stuff like water, salts, and sugars get through, creating a filtrate. Big stuff like proteins and cells stay behind.
Step two is reabsorption, getting the good stuff back.
Yes, this is the selective part. Your body actively pulls back the glucose, amino acids, and most of the water and salts that it needs.
Then step three, secretion.
This is like targeted disposal, actively moving other wastes or toxins from the blood directly into the filtrate.
And finally, step four, excretion.
The processed filtrate, now called urine, leaves the body,
You see that four-step plan in all sorts of different structures, like the protonephridia and flatworms.
which are mostly for osmoregulation, not waste. They're these little networks of tubules ending in flame bulbs with cilia that beat to draw in fluid and pump out tons of dilute urine.
And in earthworms, we have metanephridia.
A bit more complex, they collect fluid from the body cavity and have a long tubule that reabsorbs salts. Since they live in damp soil, they're always taking on water, so they need to produce dilute urine, kind of like a freshwater fish.
But insects, the water conservation masters, they have Malpighian tubules.
And this system is brilliant because it skips filtration entirely.
Ketofiltration, how does that work?
The tubules actively secrete uric acid and salts into the tubule. Water follows by osmosis. Then, in the rectum, almost all of that water is reabsorbed, leaving behind that nearly dry paste. It's incredibly efficient.
Which brings us to, I guess, the pinnacle of this design, the mammalian kidney.
The ultimate water processing organ. If you look at it, you've got the outer layer, the renal cortex, and the inner part, the renal medulla.
And the functional units are the nephrons.
Millions of them. Most are short cortical nephrons. But the ones that do the heavy lifting for water conservation are the juxtamedullary nephrons with their really long loops that dip way down into the medulla.
Okay, let's follow the path. Let's trace a drop of filtrate through one of these nephrons. Where does it start?
It starts in the cortex. Blood enters a little capillary knot called the glomerulus, which is nestled inside Bowman's capsule. The pressure is high, so it forces a bunch of fluid and small solutes out of the blood and into the capsule. That's our filtrate.
And right away, it enters the proximal tubule.
This is the bulk reabsorption workhorse. It immediately starts pulling back about 2/3 of the water, almost all of the glucose and amino acids, and a lot of salt. It also helps manage blood pH.
So it's reclaiming a huge amount right off the bat. Then the filtrate heads down into the descending limb of the loop of Henle.
And this is where the concentration really begins. This part of the loop is super permeable to water, but not to salt. And as it dives deeper into the salty medulla, water just rushes out by osmosis.
So the filtrate gets more and more concentrated as it goes down.
Exactly. By the bottom of the loop, it can be as concentrated as 1,200 meganel.
Then it makes a hairpin turn and comes back up the ascending limb.
And here, the properties totally flip. The ascending limb is impermeable to water, but now it's permeable to salt.
So salt starts moving out.
Right. First, passively in the thin section, then it's actively pumped out in the thick section. So as the filtrate moves up, it's losing salt but keeping its water, meaning it gets more and more dilute again.
So by the time it gets to the top, to the distal tubule, it's actually less concentrated than our blood?
Precisely. The distal tubule is for fine-tuning. It regulates potassium and sodium chloride levels and makes final pH adjustments.
Then all of this goes into the collecting duct.
And the collecting duct makes one final pass down through that salty medulla. And this is the key. Its permeability to water is under hormonal control.
Ah, so this is where the body decides whether to save water or get rid of it.
Yes. If you're dehydrated, hormones make the duct permeable to water. Water flows out one last time into the salty medulla, and you produce very concentrated urine. A little bit of urea even leaks out here to help keep the medulla extra salty.
This whole process, this countercurrent multiplier system, is just mind-boggling. How does the body maintain that intense salt gradient in the medulla?
Well, the multiplier part is the loop of Henle itself. It uses energy to actively pump salt out, which creates the gradient from 300 at the top to 1,200 at the bottom. The countercurrent part also involves the blood vessels.
The vasa recta.
Exactly. Those capillaries run alongside the loop in the opposite direction. This countercurrent flow lets them pick up all the reabsorbed water without washing away the salt gradient that the loop works so hard to build. It's an amazing piece of engineering.
And you can tell how much an animal needs to conserve water just by looking at its nephrons.
Absolutely. A desert mammal, like an Australian hopping mouse, has incredibly long juxtamedullary loops. It can produce urine that's like 10 times more concentrated than ours. Something like a beaver, which lives in water, has mostly short loops.
The vampire bat example is just perfect for this.
It's metabolic flexibility in action. After it feeds, it needs to get airborne, so its kidneys pump out huge volumes of dilute urine to shed weight. But later, it has to process all that protein, which creates a ton of urea. So the kidneys switch gears completely and start making tiny amounts of super concentrated urine to save water while getting rid of the waste.
None of this would work without a command system. Let's talk about the hormones, starting with the main one for water balance, ADH.
Antidiuretic hormone. Your body releases this when it senses you're dehydrated. Maybe you've been sweating or you ate a bag of salty chips. Osmoreceptors in your hypothalamus detect that your blood is too concentrated and signal the pituitary to release ADH.
And ADH talks to the kidney.
It talks directly to the collecting ducts. It tells them to insert more aquaporin water channels into their membranes.
So the ducts suddenly become like a sponge?
Exactly. Highly permeable. Water rushes out, gets reabsorbed, and you produce less urine. Your blood osmolarity goes back to normal.
Which is why alcohol is a diuretic, right? It messes with ADH.
It inhibits ADH release so those aquaporins don't get inserted, the water stays in the duct, and you produce a lot of dilute urine, which is why you get so dehydrated.
Okay, so that's for water balance. What about when blood volume or pressure drops, like from an injury?
That's a different system, the RAAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system.
Okay, break that down.
When pressure drops, a special sensor in the kidney called the JGA releases an enzyme, renin. Renin sets off a cascade that produces a powerful hormone called angiotensin II.
And angiotensin II is the first responder here.
It does two big things immediately. First, it constricts blood vessels all over the body to raise blood pressure. Second, it tells the adrenal glands to release another hormone, aldosterone.
And what does aldosterone do?
Aldosterone tells the distal tubules and collecting ducts to reabsorb more sodium. And where sodium goes, water follows. So you retain more salt and water, which brings your blood volume and pressure back up.
And there must be a brake on this system for when blood pressure gets too high.
There is. It's a hormone called ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. It's released by the atria of the heart itself when they get stretched by high blood volume. ANP shuts down the RAAS system, promoting salt and water excretion to lower blood pressure.
It's a constant, delicate balancing act. The whole thing starts with simple physics osmosis and ends with this incredibly complex, multi-organ hormonal control system.
It really is. We've seen how everything from an animal's choice of nitrogenous waste ammonia, urea, or uric acid, to the very structure of its nephron is perfectly tailored to its environment and its need for water. Form truly follows function.
It's astounding. So let's leave you with a final thought on that hormonal control. We talked about ADH bringing in the aquaporins for water and the RAAS system using aldosterone to bring in salt and water. What if you had a genetic condition where your ADH receptors just didn't work, but your RAAS system was perfectly fine?
Well, that's a fascinating and dangerous scenario. Your body would sense the falling blood volume from water loss and fire up the RAAS system like crazy. Aldosterone levels would be sky high, desperately trying to reabsorb sodium to pull water back in.
But it wouldn't work.
It couldn't, because without the ADH signal, the collecting ducts never get their aquaporin channels. They're impermeable to water. So all that water would just stay in the tubule and rush out of the body as massive amounts of dilute urine. The RAAS system would be hitting the accelerator, but the plumbing itself would be broken. It's a powerful reminder that all these complex systems have to work in perfect sync.